I was just fixing my landlady's fence when she surprised me with 5 quiet words, "Come inside for a drink." I thought it would be nothing, but the moment I stepped through her door, everything between us began to change. The late afternoon sun was leaning low, casting long shadows across the yard. I remember the way the air smelled, fresh cut grass mixed with the sharp, resinous scent of the cedar boards I was fitting into place. My hands were rough with dust and splinters, palms stinging a little from hours of hammering and pulling nails, but I didn't mind. There was something grounding about the work, something simple and honest in repairing what was broken. I paused for a moment, leaning the hammer against my thigh, brushing sweat from my forehead with the back of my arm. That's when I heard her voice for the first time that day. "You're really putting in the work out here." I turned, and there she was, my landlady, standing on the porch just a few yards away. The first thing I noticed wasn't just her presence, but the way she carried it. She stood with one hand resting lightly against the doorframe, posture graceful but relaxed, as though she had no need to demand attention, yet commanded it all the same. Her hair was tied back loosely, a few strands escaping to catch the sunlight, and she wore a simple blouse tucked into jeans that somehow made her look elegant without trying. She smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile people flash out of politeness. It was quieter, softer, like a secret she was almost willing to share. I felt my chest tighten, a strange flutter that came not from attraction alone, but from the warmth of being noticed. "Just trying to make sure the fence holds up," I managed, suddenly aware of how young I must have seemed, sweaty, dusty, standing there with a bent nail in my hand. She stepped down one stair, the wood creaking under her heel, and tilted her head as if to study my work. "It looks better already," she said. Her voice carried something calm and assured, like she was used to making judgments people trusted. Yet underneath, there was a note I couldn't quite place, something that made me want to listen longer, to ask questions just to hear her answer. I bent back to the fence, pretending to focus on aligning the next board, though the truth was I could feel her gaze on me, and it made every movement feel slower, heavier, more deliberate. "You must be thirsty," she called after a moment, her tone softer now. "When you're done, come inside. I'll pour you a drink." The words landed more heavily than I expected, stirring something unsteady in me. It was an ordinary offer, innocent on the surface, but the way she said it, gentle, almost personal, made my pulse quicken. I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Sure," I said finally, though the word felt too small for the moment. She lingered just a second longer, eyes resting on mine before she turned back toward the house, the screen door closing softly behind her. For a long moment, I just stood there, hammer in hand, the fence forgotten. The air felt different now, charged, alive, as though the simple yard I had been working in all afternoon had quietly transformed into the threshold of something I didn't yet understand. I finished setting the last board in place, brushing the sawdust from my hands. The sun had dipped lower now, painting the yard in a hazy golden glow. My muscles ached pleasantly, the kind of tiredness that comes with honest work, but the thought of stepping into her house, the invitation she had left hanging in the air, made my chest beat with something far less familiar. I set the hammer down, wiped my palms nervously against my jeans, and made my way toward the porch. The wood creaked under my boots, and for a second I thought of turning back. It was just a drink, nothing more, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling that once I crossed that threshold, things would never feel quite the same again. She opened the door before I could knock, as though she had been waiting. "There you are," she said lightly, her lips curving into that quiet, knowing smile again. "Come in. You've earned it." The air inside was cooler, shaded, carrying the faint scent of coffee and something floral, maybe her perfume, faint but unmistakable. Her living room was cozy without being cluttered. A few books were stacked on the coffee table, framed photographs lined the mantel. It felt lived in, real, and instantly warmer than the bright glare of the yard I had just left behind. She guided me toward the kitchen with an easy confidence, reaching for 2 glasses from the cabinet. The sound of them clinking against the counter seemed louder than it should have been. She moved with a kind of graceful certainty, like someone used to her space, yet there was a softness in the way she glanced at me over her shoulder. "Wine okay?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, though my voice came out quieter than I intended. She poured, the dark red catching the low kitchen light. When she handed me the glass, her fingers brushed against mine. It was the briefest touch, but it jolted through me, her skin warm, smooth, delicate yet steady. I swallowed hard, pretending to study the swirl of the wine. "To fences that finally stand straight," she said with a light laugh, raising her glass. I lifted mine. "To fences," I echoed, though my eyes lingered on her more than the drink. We settled at the small wooden table by the window. The world outside had grown softer, the sky shifting from gold to muted blue. Sitting across from her, I noticed details I hadn't before: the faint lines at the corner of her eyes when she smiled, the way she tapped her finger against the stem of her glass when she was thinking. She looked at me not like a landlady to a tenant, but as though she was studying me, measuring the space between us with something unspoken. The conversation started simply, about the fence, the neighborhood, the way summers here always seemed too hot too soon. But under the words there was a hum. Each pause stretched a little longer than necessary. Each smile lingered a fraction too long. I realized then that I wasn't just sitting in her kitchen having a drink. I was crossing into a place where ordinary moments carried weight, where silence itself seemed to lean closer, pressing gently at the edges of something neither of us had yet named. The wine eased its way into the silence between us, softening the edges of the moment. I sat across from her at the small kitchen table, the wood polished smooth by years of use, a faint ring from an old coffee cup etched near my hand. The window above the sink let in the last traces of twilight, painting her face in a shifting glow that made me notice every detail: the delicate curve of her jaw, the gentle lines carved by both laughter and worry, the steady calm in her eyes. She was the first to lean back, sighing softly as if setting down a weight no one else could see. "You know," she said, swirling the stem of her glass, "sometimes I think this house has seen more of me than most people ever will." I tilted my head, not sure if she meant to sound so vulnerable. "What do you mean?" Her smile was faint, almost self-conscious. "It's easy to become defined by responsibilities, by what everyone expects of you. People see the role you play, but not always the person inside of it." Her words hung in the air, heavier than I expected. I wanted to answer carefully, to honor the honesty she had just offered. "I get that," I said quietly. "I feel like I'm still trying to figure out who I am before anyone decides for me." She looked at me then, really looked. It wasn't just polite eye contact. Her gaze lingered steady, as though she was weighing my words and finding something true in them. For a moment I felt exposed, but not in a way that made me want to hide. The conversation shifted, unspooling itself gently between us. She spoke about her career, about the long hours and the quiet exhaustion that came from always being the dependable one. She laughed once, a low, warm sound, when she admitted how much she hated fixing small things around the house. "That fence out there," she said, shaking her head with a smile, "would have stayed broken forever if I were left to it. I can manage a meeting room full of people, but give me a hammer and I'm hopeless." I grinned, relaxing a little. "Well, at least I'm good for something." Her eyes softened at that, and she tilted her glass toward me. "You're good for more than that. I can see it." The words landed deeper than she could have known. I felt warmth spread through me, not from the wine, but from the simple fact that she noticed me in a way most people didn't. We fell into a quiet pause, and it wasn't uncomfortable. The silence was full, charged, like the space between two notes of a song. She rested her elbow on the table, chin in her hand, eyes never leaving mine. I realized then how rare it was to sit with someone older, wiser, and yet feel as though she was meeting me at my level, not above it. She wasn't talking to me. She was talking with me. And in that moment, I wanted nothing more than for the conversation to never end. The bottle of wine had lowered between us, the two glasses refilled once, then again, the ruby liquid catching the dim kitchen light like a secret shared only in shadows. Our conversation had wandered from her life to mine, laughter slipping easily between heavier confessions, until even silence began to feel like a companion rather than a gap to be filled. She leaned forward to reach for the bottle, her fingers graceful, practiced. Almost without thinking, I reached at the same time, wanting to be helpful, wanting to ease the moment. Our hands met halfway, overlapping on the cool glass neck. For a heartbeat neither of us moved. Her skin against mine was warm, smooth, and alive in a way that made my pulse stumble. The contact was nothing, an accident, just a simple brush of fingers, but it carried more weight than it should have. She looked up at me, her eyes locking onto mine with a sudden sharpness, as though she too felt the tremor of that touch. The silence thickened, filling the space between us with a quiet hum, the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. I should have pulled back. Instead, I lingered, just a second too long. She was the one to break it, withdrawing her hand with a soft laugh that carried the faintest crack in its steadiness. "I guess we both had the same idea," she said, her tone light but her eyes still holding mine as though they hadn't quite let go of the moment. I nodded, swallowing, pretending to focus on steadying the bottle as I poured. But inside, my chest was alive with restless energy, a mix of nerves and something deeper, something I didn't want to name yet. When I slid her glass across the table, she reached out slowly, deliberately, her fingers brushing the stem, but also grazing mine again, barely, as if testing whether the earlier spark had been real. Her cheeks carried the faintest color, not from the wine alone. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, a small gesture that felt oddly intimate, as though it belonged not to formality but to closeness. I tried to steady myself by speaking. "You ever feel like some moments slow down? Like the air gets heavier, and you notice every detail?" She tilted her head, studying me, her lips parting just slightly before curving into the smallest smile. "Yes," she whispered, almost to herself. For a long moment after either of us spoke. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint patter of the rain beginning outside, the steady rhythm of my own heart, it all seemed louder than words. I sat there, aware of how close we suddenly felt, though the table still separated us. A simple brush of fingers had drawn an invisible line, and though we hadn't crossed it, both of us seemed to be standing on its edge. And in that stillness, I realized, it wasn't the wine that made me lightheaded. It was her. The rain began as a faint tapping on the roof, so soft I thought it might have been my imagination. Then it grew steadier, a curtain of sound wrapping itself around the house, muting the world beyond the walls. The kitchen light seemed to glow warmer against the gray blur outside, cocooning us in a space that felt almost separate from time. She had grown quieter, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass absent-mindedly. I could see the weight of her thoughts pressing against her posture, her shoulders lowering slightly, her eyes dimming though her lips still carried the faint suggestion of a smile. "You know," she began, her voice softer than before. "It's strange. You can fill your life with people, family, coworkers, neighbors, and still feel, apart from it all." Her words sank into me, not just as something she said, but as something she had been holding back for a long while. I leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table, my voice low so it wouldn't break the spell of the moment. "Lonely?" She looked at me then, and her eyes gave the answer before her lips did. "Yes," she whispered. "Lonely, even when I shouldn't be." I felt a tug deep inside, a mix of protectiveness and admiration. This woman, strong, composed, so sure of herself, was letting me see the fragile edges beneath. It was a gift, a trust, and I wanted to hold it gently. "I think I understand," I said, my throat tightening with honesty. "Most days I don't even know where I fit yet. But when you notice me, like you did today, it feels like I belong somewhere." Her lips parted, as though she hadn't expected that kind of answer. A faint flush touched her cheeks, and she lowered her eyes, her hand resting lightly on the table between us. For a moment, I hesitated. The rain filled the silence, steady and protective, as if urging me forward. Slowly, carefully, I reached across the table, placing my hand over hers. Her skin was warm against mine, soft but tense at first, as though her instinct was to pull back. But she didn't. Instead, Her fingers shifted slightly, curling into mine with a hesitant kind of acceptance. The touch was small, nothing dramatic, but it carried everything words could not. My chest tightened with the weight of it, the connection, the permission, the unspoken truth that lingered between us. She exhaled, almost a sigh, and lifted her eyes to meet mine. They glistened faintly, though she was not crying. "You're too young to carry words like that," she murmured, her voice trembling in spite of the teasing edge. I smiled faintly, though my heart was pounding. "Maybe. But I mean them." The rain beat harder against the glass, but inside the kitchen, the world had narrowed to just the warmth of her hand in mine, the closeness of her gaze, and the fragile, beautiful admission that we were both more alike in our loneliness than we had dared to believe. The storm outside deepened, the rain striking harder against the windows, wind carrying it in uneven bursts. The kitchen had grown dimmer, the single light above us casting a golden circle over the table, while the rest of the house seemed to fold into shadows. We hadn't let go of each other's hand for a long while. At some point, it no longer felt like a gesture of comfort. It had become something steadier, something that anchored us both. But eventually, she drew in a deep breath, easing her fingers free. Not with reluctance, but with the quiet awareness that the moment had shifted. She stood, smoothing the side of her blouse almost nervously, and crossed toward the wide window that overlooked the backyard. "It sounds worse than it is," she said, nodding toward the storm, though her voice carried a softness that betrayed her distraction. I rose too, carrying my half-finished glass with me, and stopped a step behind her. The air felt different here, cooler, carrying the faint draft of rain through the old frame. She stood close enough that I could smell the subtle trace of her perfume, faint under the sharper scent of the storm outside. For a while neither of us spoke. We just stood side by side, watching the rain turn the yard into rippling silver. The silence between us wasn't heavy this time. It was alive, full of things that didn't need to be said aloud. She glanced at me then, her shoulder brushing lightly against mine. The touch was so slight I might have imagined it, but the warmth that followed was real, sharp, undeniable. "Thank you," she said suddenly, her voice lower now, as though the words were meant only for me. I looked at her, caught off guard. "For what?" "For today. For fixing that fence. For listening." She hesitated, her eyes flickering downward before lifting again, steady. "For making me feel less alone." Her words stirred something deep in my chest, something both tender and unsteady. I wanted to answer, to tell her what this night was doing to me, but the truth tangled itself on my tongue. Instead, I said quietly, "I like being here." She held my gaze, and in that instant it felt as though the storm outside had slowed. The house, the rain, even my own pulse seemed suspended. Her lips parted slightly, a breath caught between us. For a fleeting moment, I thought she might close the space, might bridge that final distance that had been humming between us all evening. But she didn't. Instead, she leaned gently, resting her head against my shoulder. The contact was so simple, yet it stole the air from my lungs. Her hair brushed my cheek, soft and faintly scented with rain and warmth. Her weight against me was light, almost cautious, but it filled me with a fierce sense of closeness. My heart thudded beneath her, every beat reminding me of how dangerously near we had drifted. I didn't move. I couldn't. I only stood there, holding my breath, feeling her trust settle against me like something sacred. And in that quiet I knew, I didn't want this night to end. The rain softened after a while, shifting from its furious strumming to a calmer, steady rhythm against the glass. It was as though the storm itself had exhaled, letting the night settle into something quieter, gentler. She hadn't moved from my shoulder, and I hadn't dared to move either. I stood there, heart beating slow and heavy, aware of every second she allowed herself to rest against me. It wasn't passion that filled the moment, it was trust, fragile and rare, and I felt protective of it in a way I couldn't put into words. When she finally straightened, it was gradual, almost reluctant, as though she had to pull herself back to the present. She smoothed her hair, her fingers brushing the strand that had fallen across her cheek, and she turned toward me with a smile that carried more weight than anything she had said all evening. "I should let you go," she murmured, her tone both warm and regretful. "I don't mind staying," I admitted, my voice rough with honesty. "Not if you want me to." Her eyes lingered on mine at that, and for a fleeting second the space between us felt charged again, like one word, one movement could change everything. But she only gave a small, knowing shake of her head. "Another time, maybe. Tonight, this was enough." She led me toward the door, the quiet of the house broken only by the soft creak of the floorboards beneath our steps. The warmth of the kitchen, the intimacy of the window, it all trailed behind us, leaving the hallway dim and hushed. At the door, she reached for the handle, then paused. Her hand found my arm lightly, fingertips resting there in a way that stopped me more than her words ever could. She looked up at me, her eyes steady, unguarded. "Thank you," she said again, and this time it wasn't about the fence, or the wine, or even the conversation. It was deeper. It was for being present in a moment when she needed it most. I nodded, unable to trust myself with more than that. My throat was too tight, my chest too full. The door opened to the cool night air, the smell of rain still sharp, the street lamps reflecting in the wet pavement outside. I stepped onto the porch slowly, reluctant to leave the glow of her presence behind. As I turned, she stood in the doorway, framed in the soft yellow light of the hall. She didn't say anything more, but her eyes held mine one last time before she let the screen door ease shut. I walked down the steps, the damp air clinging to my skin, my pulse still racing from everything that hadn't been spoken. And as I crossed the yard, the repaired fence standing straight and strong beside me, I realized the truth. It hadn't just been a drink. It hadn't just been a quiet evening. It was the beginning of something I hadn't dared to imagine, something fragile, tender, and quietly extraordinary.